Hi, my name is Raina Mandel, and I chose to do my infographic on women in the Olympic Games. I landed on this topic after thinking about my interest in athletics and also an interest in women's equality and rights. And I decided, after narrowing it down a little more with research, that it would be interesting to do it on the Olympic Games themselves, as this is the highest level of sports achievement and competition that they can really get to. Diving into creating this graphic, I ensured that I provided a wide range of data so that I could utilize each form of visual potential, that being appearance, numbers, location, time, and relationships. Looking first into numbers, I used numbers to quantify a fact with things such as the how many, how much, or how big. I have two unique charts that exploit this visual potential of numbers. Starting from the top, I used a bar chart which represents the percentage of women competing each year in the Olympics. In this display, the gray section contrasts, being the men, whereas the red section represents women. This data was meant to represent the number of women that competed each year. I thought about doing this in a number of ways to represent the numbers to compare men and women, but decided to go over a general percentage. I chose to do this as a percentage because the numbers of athletes each year vary kind of randomly. However, the way that we compare the number of those athletes that are men versus the number that are women can see a general trend over time. I tried showing this data in a number of continuous motions to show the trend. However, I landed on doing this in a bar graph to show that there are distinctive points, each happening at discrete times every 4 years as the Olympics occurs, versus a continuous change. My second numbers display is the pie chart below, showing the small section of women in sports media, which is clearly a very small portion of the total media, representing only 5%. These numbers also represent a comparison of women versus men, encoding women in red and men in gray. I considered displaying this in two different circles, to encode one for women and one for men, and show it as different sizes. However, I decided to show the women as a small fraction of the whole, as these are percentages, and it seemed more logical to show percentages on a pie chart. Below that, you can see my encoding for the visual potential of location by showing the 3 countries that were the last ones to send women to the Olympic Games. I chose to present 2012 because it was the first year that every country sent a woman to the Olympic Games. However, my original attempts at showing this map had been a display of the entire country and pointing out how many people came from each country. I tried encoding this with size of circles and also with the color of each country. However, given the large number of countries, this didn't make a good demonstration of the point, that this was the first year where every single country competed. The visual language of location is used to show the where of any situation, and the last place to send women to the Olympics in 2012 for the first time, having such a close proximity to one another, is also an interesting factor of the location that came about in this display, which could not be explained without location as a form of visual potential. It would be harder to find on a larger map. Moving on to my central display, I used the visual potential of appearance to help give the reader a sense of my topic at a glance. With the large size of this, I made it very prominent, from the background image of the athlete doing a hurdle, that they can quickly tell my topic is probably something athletic, especially when combined with the images in my timeline of other sports-related icons such as the basketball or the trophy. The visual language of appearance is used to help a reader get a better understanding of the topic. In the same display, I exploited the visual potential of time, which is something that can show things as they progress in sequence. I also used numbers in display to add to the depth of this display, but not only displaying the timeline in sequence by year, which is shown in the horizontal progression of the facts, but also by the number of sports that were in the games each year, which is shown in the vertical placement, moving upwards and to the right over time, as there were more sports added each year. Displaying relationships was something that was much more difficult for me in this topic. It's important to show how things are related to one another and how they affect one another. However, in order to fit my models, I needed to show specific relationships between people, which finally landed me on the relationship of members of the Internal Olympic Committee, in order to point out that there were very few women in this committee, especially for the important roles such as president. I had considered examining the relationship physically between women and men, but was not able to match my models or find too much valuable knowledge. After exploring the breakdown of the IOC, I was able to notice that there was more of a disparity between women and men in the committee than there were throughout most of the sports at this time. This adds another interesting dimension to the relationship between men and women in the Olympics. I used my simple monochromatic color to keep the color bold and point out what is important in my model. It's used as both an encoding to represent a number of women in certain displays and to draw attention to important aspects, such as the timeline or the map. I chose the red color to emphasize the important facts and keep the colors simple, while setting a tone of strength for women. Red typically sets a tone of strength, courage, and confidence that I wanted to portray in my graphic, as it's important that women have more involvement in athletics, which requires their social position to change slightly over time to gain more trust from society in their strength and ability. The main method of encoding used throughout my graphic is color encoding. I wanted to keep a consistent encoding throughout my entire graphic to show information about women specifically in red, as that was the only color I had in my model, compared with men in gray. I chose to use it to really make this information stand out. However, not everything could be encoded between women and men, and other things were just used to draw emphasis to the facts. Going back to my numbers displays, I showed the difference of women and men solely in the different numbers of athletes, which I chose to show as a percentage because the total number of athletes can vary each year. In order to really see a trend over time, it was more clear to show a simple comparison in a percentage. As mentioned before, and as noted in the article Bars and Lines, a study of graphic communication, bar graphs better identify separate instances. This worked better for the Olympics, which only happens every 4 years, encoded the actual values of the percentages by height of the red bar as a percent. This is clear to the reader each year. Doing this in discrete bars makes it more clear which specific points it had taken place while still showing a trend over time. I also use this color encoding by putting women in red and men in green or gray, showing the percentages of sports media devoted to women in the number displayed below. Keeping the encoding consistent, as red again represents the share of women and gray to encode men, I was able to create a uniformity. I could have encoded the comparison by size, showing 2 different circles. However, I chose to use a pie chart to show how it relates to the whole. In the location display below, the color is used to indicate the areas where women were sent. However, each country sent women, so rather than indicating women in the display, it's simply used to draw attention to the countries that I chose to focus on for my display that are the most recently added to the Olympics. Here the color encoding does not specifically refer to women compared to men, but simply draws emphasis to the countries that I refer to, in order to make them easily identifiable. I used this red and gray color encoding again in my relationship display. However, I used it over the entire image, not just a section that represents a number, as each individual represents exactly one person. I used another type of encoding here by using size to indicate importance of roles in the relationship towards the bottom of the page. By encoding size of certain people, I was able to display that their roles were unique and important. It's also interesting to note here that the 2 individual and more important roles that have been enlarged were both taken by men. My timeline simply encodes the information by the position that the bubbles are placed in order to represent the time and number of sports along an axis. For my font, I used a combination of italics and bold capitalized fonts. The italics were only used to accentuate words, while the bold capital letters were used for the main labels to make them stand out. My typography model was slightly hard to follow in their use of fonts and title sections, as I had less levels of division than my model, which had their sections labeled in all capital bold letters, and subsections in italics. I labeled my sections in bold, but did not have subsections to italicize. I did, however, use italics to accentuate things, such as the labels and the descriptions of timeline elements, such as the year that each of the timeline elements occurred. I executed most of my labels, both identity and precision, using proximity, like my visual language model, by putting the label close to the thing that I wanted to label. Identity labels being things like identifying what something is, such as the names by the relationship display at the bottom, being simply near the images of that person, compared to precision titles, like the numbers upon the timeline, which are also just placed nearby to associate. As for the layout of my graphic, my visual language model used both position size and color contrast. Similarly, I was able to make my visual language of appearance very prominent to show that my graphics about athletes in a large image across the back which matched my visual language model. However, I did choose to put the timeline over the front of this image instead of dropping it behind like my model because I wanted to maintain the position and integrity of these points relative to one another on the timeline. I did not actually want my appearance to be quite as prominent as in the Pitbull graphic, as the one athlete in mind was not the sole focus of my graphic specifically, but rather athletics as a whole. I believe through my visual language hierarchy, the viewer would first notice the large image, then move to the timeline that overlays it, because not only are they very bold in color contrast, but being the top left display is the natural way that a reader would first read a graphic. Next, I believe the reader would follow the displays down the far right from top to bottom, which is why I chose to put the number of athletes on top, because I believe this display is very important to showing a distinct trend over time to introduce the topic, which I wanted to highlight. Due to a lighter color in the placement at the bottom, though it's larger, the relationship diagram will likely be viewed last, after all the displays on the right, which I chose because it makes more sense to read this relationship in the context of other places that we see inequality between men and women above. This layout is laid out very similarly to my layout model. However, I did expand the spaces on the far right to only have 3 displays and leave the bottom open in order to expand my relationship display all the way across the bottom. I did this for 2 reasons. First, I did not have enough displays for each individual box, and second, I had a hard time fitting the relationship display into a smaller space, which made it hard to read. I chose my layout to have an obvious main central focus, to draw attention to my woman in the timeline, which maintained the hierarchy of information along the lines of my visual language model, as I discussed before. I kept each element as its own information and did not group any of them into subcategories because there were no groupings really in my models. And all of the displays I chose were unique and could stand alone in their own contexts. Within these models, I chose most of my alignment to be to the left, especially for text, but for the graphics to be aligned to the center. There's a dramatic variation of alignment in my visual language model. However, my layout model was mostly centered towards the center. I chose, different from my visual language model, to have all my titles aligned to the left in order to create more unity across the graphic. Each of the titles of my right-hand displays are horizontally aligned. I created unity between each display and their titles by keeping the font and style of titles in all capitals, underlined, and then adding details below to follow in the same font between each display. This creates unity through the text of each display. I used both similarity and difference in the circular forms across the page, using circular shapes in multiple displays, along with sharp lines between and within in different ways, and even amplified in different colors, such as the red ring around my timeline events, compared with the much less prominent light gray in the bottom relationship displays, and even a medium gray in my pie chart. Overall, I believe I was able to portray a lot of information about women in the Olympics. Though I occasionally had to make choices to stray away from my models, I learned a lot from using a positive and successful graphic to mimic.